Here we are live. Welcome everyone. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to North Star, our Future in Space series. This is episode 3 and is entitled The Space Relay Race, Advanced Frameworks and Leadership to Promote Sustainable Activity in Space. So LEO is increasingly congested and debris fields can impact space infrastructure, which we rely on globally. We need cohesive frameworks to maintain a sustainable space environment for the next generation. However, we are in a moment in history where leadership lacks the coordinated effort to build binding rules and incentives. And we know that the space sector is commercially risky, and this will worsen. So we need space sustainability because a sustainable space is good for business. But how do we survive a moment in which we need a cohesive framework, but we lack a cohesive leadership? And there are many ways in which we could tackle this topic. There is the political angle, there is the technological angle, the legal, the economic. But today we will focus on roles and responsibilities, on framework and leadership from a policy standpoint. So North Star has brought together 4 fantastic experts with hands-on experience in addressing these issues. Allow me to introduce you our fantastic panel. Joining us today, there are Dr. Ruth Stillwell, the Executive Director of Aerospace Policy Solution, LLSC. Ruth, welcome.
Thank you.
And Chris Blackerby, the Group COO at Astroscale. Chris, welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
Kevin O'Connell, the CEO of Space Economy Rising and Chairman US Board of North Star. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks, Emma.
And last but not least, Stuart Bain, the founder and CEO of North Star. Welcome.
Aloha.
Yes, Ruth and Stuart are in Hawaii, while Chris, Kevin, and we are in Paris. So this is truly a miracle of digitalization and technology. Before we start this panel, allow me to remind everyone that we love interaction. We love suggested questions. This will make the discussion much richer and interactive. So please do write your question in the chat and feel free to keep them coming. And last but not least, North Star produced a fantastic Brian May approved t-shirt called Don't Stop Me Now. And you all have the possibility to win one. So North Star will pick a lucky winner and will get in contact with you, or with him or her, of course, at the end of the seminar. So stay tuned for this one too. And now let's get started. So we decided to structure this live session with one macro question per each guest, and then everyone will pitch in and will discuss. So it's more of a round table of discussion rather than a very tight interview. Chris, let's start from you. So our goal is to create, we say, the sustainable orbital environment for future generations. In terms of roles and responsibilities, which roles do you think are still undefined, and how should responsibilities be divided from your point of view?
Well, thank you, Emma. And it's great to be here with everyone in this global panel. I wonder, are the panelists eligible to win the t-shirt? Or not? No go? Oh, you're already wearing one. Okay.
You are. I think you are.
Wow. All right. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. So we all know, we're here. Kevin and I are here in Paris. Ruth and Stuart are there in Hawaii. We know this is a global issue. We know this growth of the space ecosystem has expanded so incredibly over the last several years. And now we have these predictions that we're talking about, space ecosystem of 1.5 trillion, 2 trillion, 3. What are we up to now? I'm not sure. The numbers continue to increase. But the fact is, we're not going to get there if we can't keep that ecosystem sustainable. If we continue to put up assets and we continue to utilize it the way we've been doing without taking into account the need to make it sustainable, our children and their children are not going to have the same benefits of the orbital environment that we do today. And that's really the baseline for what Astroscale was. Astroscale, I'm not sure if even you guys know this, Kevin, with your familiarity with our company, what Astroscale, why we chose Astroscale. The Astro is easy, space, but the scale is a balance between sustainability and development. And that's what we're really focused on, is trying to make sure that we do create this sustainable orbital environment so that we can have this resource for our children, and so that it can be a business research. As Emma said from the start, this is an economic problem, not just an environmental one. And the way we see it at Astroscale is that what's going to be essential to create this is a mature, economical, efficient, effective, and safe satellite servicing industry. We need to get to a point where we are not only removing debris, but we are repairing satellites on orbit. We're refueling them. We're moving them from one orbit to another. We're watching out for risks in orbit. All of this is what's going to help contribute to making this orbital environment sustainable, just like it would on any ecosystem. And in any ecosystem, you want to have post-sale servicing for your assets that you buy, whatever it is, whether it's a car or a microwave or an iPhone. You expect that you'll service it if something happens to it. Space is not that way. And we need to get to that point. So how do we get to that point? How do we incorporate these ideas around satellite servicing and make for a sustainable environment? I am getting to your question, Emma, and I'll answer it right now quickly, but the roles around this, and it is a joint responsibility. Astroscale is set up around the world because we know not one country can handle this. And we also know not one group can handle this. It's not just the private sector. It's not just the government. We both have the pressure on us to make this happen. And so state governments, national governments have to put in place regulations which are reasonable and achievable to allow for innovation, but to also make sure that the environment is not polluted and damaged for generations. That's on the governments. The satellite operators have to be able to take responsibility for making sure that they remove their debris in the required amount of time. The service providers, us, we need to prove the technology. We need to show that we can do it, that we're not just PowerPoint companies who are talking about it, but that we're actually taking the steps and showing governments, showing commercial operators that it can be done. Other government also, I said about the regulatory aspect, but governments also have to put in for these missions. They've got a budget for these missions to happen. And as we're moving more and more toward a commercially viable industry, because that's what we need to start seeing fully funded missions to make this happen, not just R&D or cost sharing missions. We need to see fully funded missions to really move this to a clear, commercially viable environment. We need to see this support from international organizations that drive best practices. And we need all of us, the space community, everybody who's on this call, to recognize the issue and to be evangelists for the importance of it. So really the responsibility is on everybody who is a part of the space sector. And that is everybody, by the way. We all are a part of it, whether we're working in it or we're just benefiting from it, to recognize the need to take these steps forward and to take tangible actions to make it happen.
Thank you, Chris. I really like the concept of mature approach of responsibility, the need of the industry and all the actors to recognize the problem and to discuss about it. I would be interested in hearing like our other guest perspective on what you just said. Kevin, Stuart, Ruth, do you feel anything to add to this?
Yeah, I do, because I think the points that Chris makes are very important. When we talk about space, it's not just the companies that are profiting in space. It is the benefit of the services they deliver. So we could stop today and say, okay, space is full. We're not going to move forward anymore because of debris risk or pick a thing. But so many things don't progress on Earth if we do that. And that is a very serious trade. So when we talk about sustainability, we need to look at the bigger picture and how we manage growth to enable greater benefit to people on Earth. And it takes a little bit of time to look back on how we have benefited from space so far. And you mentioned in your opening comments, so future generations enjoy the same benefits that we have. But when we look at the evolution of technology and societies, it isn't about giving the same forward. It's about enabling them to grow and innovate and move forward. And so we all have an interest here on Earth to ensure that we have the tools available to repair the damage we've done, reuse, recycle. And that is on-orbit servicing. That is removing things from orbit. That is cleaning up the mess we've made and making sure going forward, we don't start to make it worse. We have enough lessons from industrial development on Earth that we can learn from it rather than export those problems and repeat those problems again as space enters its industrial age.
Thank you, Ruth. Absolutely. We did have enough lessons, didn't we? We're not at the beginning of civilization, and yet we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. Stuart, Kevin, I would like to hear your perspective on this balance between government, the responsibility on the history and the industry. What do you think?
So I think Chris got he got the team on the field correct. It's really a 9-person baseball game, not a 3-person baseball game. And so all the parties that you mentioned are really, really important. The challenge is going to be how we use them synergistically. How do we make sure that they're working together, pulling in the same direction? As many of you know, when you talk about regulation, regulation is often thought of in terms of preventing people from doing certain things. I think what we haven't explored fully at this point is the extent to which regulation can encourage the kind of behaviors that we're talking about. I think there are tools to actually to be used with industry, even across governments, to actually encourage more responsible behavior in space. I think industry plays a big role in this, as I often do. And I think what we're on the verge of is a recognition. Again, those of us that are in Paris are listening to about the hyper-competitive environment in space that is out there. Well, if I'm the CEO of a space company, what I realize is that paying attention to safety and sustainability is kind of a cost of doing business. We often hear in this space that space operators don't want to spend a nickel more than they have to on things like this. Well, no enterprise ever wants to spend a nickel more than they have to spend on anything. But I think increasingly we're hearing operators, and again, we're hearing some of it here in Paris, are realizing they have to pay attention to this because it flows down to mission assurance, it flows down to their customers and their requirements, and ultimately their revenue and profit. And so some of this requires a reframing of the way we think about this.
Thank you, Kevin. Just to build up on what you just said, Stuart, Kevin said something very interesting, the need to pay attention. What do you think? How can we raise this attention?
Yeah, I think, I'm inspired by everybody's comments, particularly the way Chris framed it. We're really talking about a circular economy. We're talking about an economy that does better when it operates as a circular economy than it does if it's just a straight race. We are doing laps. We are doing laps in orbit, right? We go around the track. We go around the orbit in LEO. It all comes back. So this notion that we've introduced as a relay race is the idea that space is not a one-shot race. It's a race that comes back over and over again, and it's passing the torch or passing the baton to future generations. Government has always, will always, does always play a very impressive role in this equation. They can't help it. Governments are the foundation of space. But commercialization is what's necessary, as in any industry, for it to get to the next level and have even more economic benefit, and with that impact, either environmentally or economically. So what we want to do is maximize the economic benefit and minimize the environmental. And that requires guidance. That requires, if you like, coaching. Maybe instead of saying regulatory, we can say, let's, as Kevin puts it, encourage. We don't want to regulate, we want to encourage. We want to encourage the economy to be strong. We want to create jobs. We want to create innovation. We want to create technology. And we want to make sure it's there and continually there every time we play the record. Absolutely. So you don't want to wear out the grooves. You want the whole thing to harmonize. So for me, that's the sense that I've always had about space. And there's just so much that we can do collectively. It's never going to be an individual thing. So it's got to be a relay race. You can't do this on your own.
Thank you, Stuart. And let's move a little bit. So both Chris and Stuart mentioned the role of governments. And Kevin, this question is for you. I was wondering, should the industry or government be responsible for setting the standards for space sustainability?
So it's a great question, Emma. Thank you. Standards, when done correctly, actually improve safety. They increase economic efficiency. They have a lot of good effects when they're done properly. But there's a big asterisk after that part of the phrase. Because this is such a high-speed industry, making sure that as this part of the relay race, governments and industry stay as close as possible. Because there are times when industry is moving so quickly because of either technological developments within house or adjacent technology areas that it's actually hard to keep up. So in the first instance, any standard, and I'll stick to the technical aspects of standards right now, those basically have to be done with really very close contact between government and industry to understand what's actually happening and frankly, what's coming down the pike in the future, if you will, sort of an anticipatory kind of approach to this thing. I think the other aspect of standards that we look at here, though, is, industry is going to set standards because it will help shape the global economy. But when do you actually declare a standard? There's a sort of a critical question. And of course, in the space industry, we're talking about thousands of different standards for thousands of different things. So I want to be too careful about generalizing things here. But if we actually set a standard too early, we can actually upend the market on the government side. And so we have to be very careful when we recognize that at least some participants in a market actually are helping create a standard or shaping a standard. Chris was involved with, still is maybe, with Confers. And one of the things we saw was that having industry talk about standards in a market that was just emerging was actually a very productive thing. It was by no means a fully consensus-based, discussion, but it actually helps inform the government on where standards are possible and helpful, as opposed to places where they're still not very useful. So the bottom line is both government and industry are very important in helping set standards. I think, and I've already peeked at one of the questions in the chat, I think when we use the broader concept of standards, I think where we are on safety and sustainability is really that industry, because of complexities at the international level and defining norms and things like that, I still am of the belief that industry will ultimately define some early best practices. They're not standards per se, but they're best practices for space operations and other things that ultimately will be codified in international norms and things like that. So that's a much broader definition of what we'll call standards here.
Ruth, I would be interested in asking you the same question I asked Kevin. What do you think when it comes to industry, government, who should lead, who should set these standards?
So they're two separate questions on who should lead and who should set the standard, because commercial industry has an opportunity to push that technology forward in a way that governments may not, although the government investment in research and development has created those opportunities for the commercial sector, particularly in the United States. So when we talk about standards, and I really like what Kevin talked about, we can't be too myopic in it, because the risk in standards development is that you try and cover everything and have one standard that everyone can meet. Then you risk having a standard that is far too low for sustainable development. But if you focus only on those operators that can meet the highest standard, then you exclude too many industries. You exclude too much innovation. So you end up actually a higher standard can stifle innovation pretty dramatically. If you look instead to the concepts of performance-based standards that are agile and scalable, you have an opportunity to tie incentives to the standard itself. Create a standard that can't be met by the current state and say, when we get here, we can do this. And look at where the benefits come from setting aspirational goals. And you can start to have government help drive that discussion, because you're building the incentive into the investment decision. And you can make it clear, this is why you want to spend the extra money on greater maneuverability, on being able to deorbit faster, investing in services to extend the life of your satellite, because that incentive is known. And that sort of gives us an opportunity to engage the commercial sector in a very forward-thinking way. But it's also very, very important that we save room for academia, for research, for new entrant operators. Because once we start excluding competition in space, we stifle innovation, and we stifle it very dramatically. So standards are not as easy as they sound. It's different approaches, and it cannot be one or the other. It has to be this partnership in tandem. And I'll go back to that relay race analogy. Is your job is to get it this far so that the next person can take it further. And if we don't coordinate that effort, we lose the race.
So I would be interested in hearing Chris and Stuart perspective, because they come from the commercial enterprises. So how what Ruth said reflects in your, allow me to say, everyday working life?
So there's a famous Canadian hockey player named Gordie Howe, also known as Mr. Hockey. Kevin is an established hockey player himself. And there's a hat trick that you talk about in hockey where you score 3 goals. There's a natural hat trick where you score 3 goals with no goals being scored in between. And then there's a Gordie Howe hat trick. The Gordie Howe hat trick is you get a goal, you get an assist, and you get a penalty. And it's called the Gordie Howe hat trick. And what's so great about getting a penalty, as I used to coach competitive hockey, if you're not pushing the boundaries of the limits of the rules, you're not playing hard enough. Industry plays hard. Government plays by rules because they represent the great public. But industry plays hard, and they'll push the boundaries, and they'll push the rules, and they'll push the system. That's also called innovation. That's also called economic growth. That's also called expansion. And so it tests our limits. We're not going to go far in space if we don't push those limits. And so expect industry to do more of the same. But I don't want to steal Chris's thunder. I'd rather highlight his thunder. The concept of finding a balance in space, astro scale, is essentially what we're talking about. How do you let industry push the limits, make a profit, grow, innovate, and still create that necessary balance with the incentives that will make that happen? And so industry is there to push. Government is there, always there, as an important client, as an important historic element, as an important tool to lever, because it's so multifaceted. And you know, Ruth talked about it. We can't handicap or hurt one state or one country over another. We have to allow everyone. We've done this in every industry. You put environmental protection rules in place, but underdeveloped countries don't get to participate because they don't have the technology to catch up with that. So we have to have that dimension in place as well. And so the more we simplify it, in the end, the better. Keep it simple and let government pick specific things they want to incentivize. And as Ruth said, don't try and solve everything at once.
Chris, agility and scalability, but also transparency, sustainability, and the idea we want to transmit something to the next generation.
And staying out of the penalty box, right? So I love the analogy. I never heard that before. Gordie Howe hat trick. That's great. And I totally agree. It takes pushing the envelope. But what I think we can do is, and Kevin, you mentioned this. I owe you a drink when I see you somewhere around the Paris bars tonight for bringing up Confers, because that is the way to make sure that the industry is talking to each other and talking to the governments, including the regulators, to make sure that the standards are clear and understandable and approachable, and we can push them without, creating any problems. And that's what we really want to do. Now, Confers, Kevin mentioned it, but as he said, I was involved. I was the president of Confers for 3 years. And during that time, it shifted from being an organization that was housed under the US government, under DARPA, to being a fully independent industry group. And what this industry group is focused on is the development of, wait for it, standards and best practices for space servicing, satellite servicing. That's the focus of the group. And it started back in 2018 with about 5 members. Now there's over 80. 80 members around the world who are joining to talk about how to move this industry forward. And so the question, Emma, was around who is driving the standards and who is setting them. The governments have to set them. That's their job, to be, those agencies that focus on that. But as all of the panelists have noted, we need the input from the industry. The government can't do it alone, and industry can't go unfettered. That is completely true. And so at Confers, we have, it is fully industry focused. The only members who are dues paying are industries, are companies. But governments are now allowed to sit in as observers. So they can take part in the conversation. They can join the discussion. And there's meetings frequently, there's briefings to the members, and the members are putting together standards that then get raised up to standards agencies, AIAA, ISO, to then be codified as future standards. So this is one way that we're really pushing this forward from an industry side that is working in concert with the government. And for those who want to be a part of the conversation, I think it's the week of November 10th in DC. There's the Satellite Servicing Forum sponsored by Confers, where all of these members get together to talk about how best to keep this conversation moving forward productively.
Thank you, Chris. Before we move to the next block of debate and question, there are a couple of questions. I will take the questions at the end, but there are a couple of them that I think would be interesting to take now because of what we're discussing. And Ashina is asking, okay, where should the chain of reaction begin? I understand it's government, small-scale companies, individual, whatever. Where are we starting? Who should start the reaction? Thank you for the analogy. I really like it. And Jacob is also asking, which government do you think is equipped the most to set the standards in today's time? So I'm taking these two questions now because they are just fitting.
So I don't know that there's a starting point necessarily, other than the fact that industry is driving the technological change in this area. And not just that, but, we'll talk maybe a little later, investment, our minds are in the investment world here in Paris this week, World Satellite. But, investors, as they invest in the space economy, they're seeking diversity amongst companies. It's the way investors think about risk and reward and things like that. And so we're seeing people explore a wide range of technological areas. And so I don't think it's a starting place per se, a declared starting place, but I think a natural starting place is industry will start by virtue of what it is driving in terms of technological change and things that they're actually doing. And it's mostly reacting both within industry. Chris, the point you made that I want to make sure people understand is that these standards are also debated at the international level when you talk about ISO and CCSDS and all these other organizations. So I think the industry will drive the need for standards, but I don't know that that's the declared starting point.
So I would say there isn't a starting point because it started 70 years ago.
Yeah.
The chain reaction is happening. And our question is whether it becomes a meltdown or it generates power. And the roles are how we tilt in the right direction so that instead of having a meltdown, we are actually generating power. And that is a very important role of governments to facilitate good behavior. And it isn't necessarily this hard regulation that says we're going to stop this, we're going to do that, unless we wait too long, because once we're in meltdown stage, then we have a serious problem.
Yeah.
So to incentivize and direct where the energy of the community is, because we are still in a very rapid innovation phase, and we don't want to stifle that. But it's very, very important that governments don't now say, okay, there's enough commercial operators, we can step away and this will take care of itself, because it will not. So I would say in that chain reaction, it is in all of our interest to push towards that energy generation, but that requires a fairly productive and engaged role from governments and not just one. And so in the which country is best to do it, the answer to that is it's not going to be just one, because you won't get to the right solution if you are just one. But if we look at models like ISS, like the Artemis Accords, we have key stakeholder nations that have the resources and capacity to develop the guidance materials that the rest of the world can adopt And the major players, the bigger player you are in space, the more important your role is. Not important in terms that we should be honoring you, but you have a higher obligation. Your obligation to ensure the future of space sustainability is greater if you have greater mass on space today.
Thank you, Ruth. Which government you guys think is more equipped to set the standard? This is Jacob.
I think Ruth's point is spot on. First of all, that this race, started with Sputnik, and it is just continuing to accelerate now. And we're already running it, and it is going to be, as both Ruth and Kevin said, it's going to be give and take between all players in this. As far as the governments, we are heartened to see that many of the governments that we're located in are taking action now. When I joined Astroscale 7 years ago, and at the time, there was very little activity being focused on trying to put in place these standards and best practices, and there's very little attention on the fact that there could even be a company that focuses on satellite servicing. Now we see dozens out there of companies that are focused on this, and we see governments that are putting in place regulations. And I keep saying regulations, maybe I shouldn't. I like the word that you used, Kevin. What is it? What did you say? Convincing or no? Helping?
Encouraging.
Putting in place encouragements. Should we just change the word to encouragements? We're putting in place encouragements.
I think I heard that.
And so we see that happening around the world. And it's not just those encouragements, it's also the budgets. So we see governments putting money into budget lines that are supporting these activities. And those are the kind of things that we see as important. But as Ruth said, I won't identify one because they all have a responsibility, and all of the ones who are spacefaring nations should be playing a role in this.
And thank you, Chris. Since we are speaking about the commercial sector, Ruth, is the commercial space sector ready to stand alone, or do we need continued government resources for it to be viable? What is the balance? Since we're speaking about balance, what is the balance between the commercial and public interest?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. So we've had a couple different sports analogies, but I'm a runner, so I want to get back to that relay race. And we talk about the runners and we talk about the records, but somebody's got to maintain the track. And there's a lot of timing equipment. There's a lot of things that go into it. And that makes that balance a little more challenging because we have had an evolution of space that was heavily dependent on government investment. And as we move to being a healthy, stable commercial sector, you have to learn to live without a dependency on government. It doesn't mean government is not a customer of services. So there's still a need for a government as customer, but as a natural customer, not funding your R&D, not paying for your losses because it's not commercially viable. But we don't want to pull out too early, because if we do that, then we have too many companies fail and we don't move forward as quickly as we need to. You don't want to let the track deteriorate. There is an infrastructure that is in the public interest. And that infrastructure is an information infrastructure, a public safety infrastructure to avoid collisions in space. There are things that we need to prevent because if they happen, they have an adverse consequence for all of the operators in space, as well as for the people who are dependent on their services on Earth. So it's not one or the other, but it is important that we continue to move towards a normalized commercial environment where companies operating in space are not dependent upon the government investment, that if they lost that one customer, the entire company fails, because that is not a healthy commercial environment. And it's a difficult path to get there. So when we talk about balance, I think that tipping point is the key question. What tipping point are we at now? Where can we start to redirect the government investment into that core infrastructure and less into the R&D part of commercial companies? So it's a hard question. And the most important thing that I hope people take from this talk is that hard problems do not have easy answers. And it will take a lot of work for all of us to examine those issues. And we need to bring in not just the technical innovation, but behavioral sciences, economists, the role of government to find where that appropriate role is, so that we have an industry that is able to flourish with an infrastructure like other industries have, airports, spaceports, ports. And they can depend on that infrastructure, but that they are no longer dependent upon the resources of a dominant customer being government. So did I avoid the question enough?
Perfect.
But it is a hard question that we need to constantly examine and re-examine as the space environment continues. And there's not a, okay, we're out, because that government infrastructure is always going to be an important part of the big public safety picture.
No, absolutely. I know it's not an easy question. Any take on this? What's your opinion, Kevin, Stuart, Chris?
I'm thinking, I'm still spinning on the last question tied to how Ruth is answering. I was going to take a different spin on the question as I answer and comment on Ruth's, in that they were saying, what is the starting point? What is the catalyst that begins the domino effect? It's obvious that it did start 70 years ago. But what we're talking about, to use orbit dynamics terms, is a delta V, a change in velocity. We're changing orbit. A delta V means you're changing velocity, you're changing orbit to change your direction, to change your trajectory. We're talking about changing a trajectory of where we're headed in space. And so I don't think anyone doesn't know that SpaceX didn't get off the ground purely on commercial enterprise. It had the US government as a massive client, and they benefit from massive government contracts, and they continue to benefit from massive government contracts. So let's not try to think that you have to do this without the government, because the biggest picture on the screen is doing it very much with the government, and the government funds their R&D, and the government buys big services from them. And that's commercial space. That is commercial space. So what I want us to rethink, and Ruth touched on it, is behavioral science. I get the sense, maybe it's just me, but I get the sense that we have this tendency to feel like we need to apologize for what we're doing historically, like we're repeating our mistakes over and over again. But instead of punishing ourselves for being who we are, I think we have to embrace who we are. I think we have to embrace the fact that we do these things because we're ambitious. We do these things because we're bold. We do these things because we want to do something more and make a difference. So we need to work with government, work with ourselves, and not try to deny these instincts, but we need to make these instincts work to our benefit. And that is the challenge. It's an individual and collective challenge to change our own trajectory in terms of how we will influence space, the economy, and humanity, because we're talking about the human aspect. It's not the technology that presents the challenges. It's not the satellites that present the challenges. It's not the governments. It's the people. It's the humans that do this. We do this. And we should not shy away from who we are. Rather, we should embrace it and build with it.
Amen. Stuart, since we are speaking, no, first of all, Kevin, Chris, any comments on what Ruth said before I move to another question for Stuart?
I would just say excellent points by both Ruth and Stuart on this. Agree that we need to have a more diversified customer base, Ruth, than just the government. At this point in time, at least speaking from the area of satellite servicing particularly, that is focused on sustainability, we're not there yet. The commercial side hasn't bought in. So the way we see it is the government missions are the essential building block to what's going to become this larger, more diverse, more healthy ecosystem. And it's the same as it is in so many deep tech sectors. You start out by seeing a government investment that I just got a thumbs down from Kevin, but
no, you didn't actually. I'm not sure what happened
Technology is rebellious.
All right, Kevin, you go next.
Sorry.
So I would just say that I would say that, like any deep tech sector, we're going to see government investment, like Stuart said, seed the innovators, and that's going to get to a proven technology, and then it's going to become more attractive for the commercial sector, and then we're going to see this more diverse, more healthy ecosystem. So I think that's exactly the path that we're on, and it's not going to be easy, but I think that's where we are going.
If I can
Emma,
add to that a little
go
bit,
ahead.
the role of government isn't just to write a check. So there are things that government can do to help make those markets
Right.
healthier. And that is investment, but also incentives and regulations. So, there is often a point where the commercial sector doesn't buy into cleaning up their pollution, but then there becomes a sufficient incentive from governments or hard regulation that says you have to. And then the industries that are coming behind saying, hey, you did great. You're very successful. Here's the problems you've created. We can help you uncreate them. They start to become viable. So not every space industry is at the same point in its technological development. And so it isn't we're going to pull out of space, but it is where you have to let your babies graduate, and they don't all graduate the same year. And that's where we can be. And so your industry in particular is serving a public good, but also still quite nascent. And so you don't want to say, oh, because we're pulling back investment from maybe launch services, that we're also pulling back investment from on-orbit servicing.
If I may on
And
that,
I think, go ahead, Stuart.
quick note, it's not the government's job to write the spec and create the document and say, build this. It's the government's job to ask the question from the perspective of what's in the interest of the government. The question is, how would you clean up space? Innovators, show me how you would do this, and to put funding into doing that. Asking the right question rather than giving the specification and, as Ruth put it, writing the check. It's not a transactional relationship. It's a community relationship. Ask me a question, me, industry, a question. We'll give you 50 answers. And then you get to go forward with those 50 answers. So this idea that the government has to fully define the specification is a delay. It's a delay. Just give us the question, and industry brings the answers. Go ahead, Kevin. Sorry.
Yeah, just a quick one. I think one of the dimensions that's lacking as we have this continuous debate about, was the government important? When will it become all commercial? All that kind of stuff. I think the piece we're not including is time. And the government, based on the maturity of a certain industry segment, whatever it could say, I'm going to fund this for the next 3 years. And if somebody can reach a level of maturity where we can become a customer in that period of time, so be it. If not, we're not going to invest in it anymore. Now, again, in government, you can always change that number if you want to. But I think, in fact, I thought I read this in the EU competitiveness report this week, this idea that says government should make a commitment, but it should be clear roughly about the time frame in which it expects to see some returns. And that's based on how many people are in the market, what other kinds of private investment, things like that, that are in the market as well.
Fantastic. Last 5 minutes before we open the stage for the questions, Stuart. Are we missing a sort of unified collaborative effort across all these sectors? Can we create a multifaceted community to address all the various challenges of space, all the challenges that we discussed so far?
Yes. Saving time. Look at that. The expression goes, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. I say, forget that. You can do both. You can go fast and far together. So back to my relay race analogy, if my memory serves, the world record for a 4x100 men's relay race is 36 seconds. There's no individual on the planet who can run 400 meters in 36 seconds. The world record is actually 43 seconds. So you can go with 4 people faster than you can with 1. And so if you keep layering that up, the more people, as you go in laps, if this is a relay race and you're going around and around, if you set one person on a track, running that track, and you had every 400 meters, you had 4 different runners, you can go fast and farther with a team. And so we need to adopt that mentality. And the community that we need to build to do it does not have to be enormous. Back to another analogy, and I think Ruth touched on it. It's about balance, as Chris puts it, but this is a game of inches, as they say in football. You don't score a touchdown every time you get the ball. You get it far enough to get closer to the first down. And then sometimes you're inches from a first down, but all you got to do is make 3 inches and you're over, and now you're going again. This is a game of inches. We must, as a community, not get a defeatist attitude that we can't solve all these problems. Ruth said it. Don't solve all the problems at once. Solve individual problems. And like the relay race analogy, we all have different lanes. Industry has a lane. Government has a lane. Regulatory has a lane. Government as a client has a lane. On-orbit servicing is a lane. Observation and space of situational awareness is a lane. Putting more internet services in space is a lane. We all have our lanes, and we stay strong in our lanes. We don't try and cross over. If we cross over, it gets really confusing. So we got to stay in our lane, and we got to focus on what we can do and contribute. But it is a game of inches. And as much as we are tolerant, and I made a post last week that I discussed afterwards with Kevin, as much as we are tolerant of, have to be tolerant of industry having this incentive to move forward, to grow, we also must be tolerant that governments, as they make policy, may go too far, and then we'll have to come back. There has to be a sense of finding that astroscale balance. You got to find that balance. You're going to go maybe too far with a proposal, maybe not a full recommendation, but you're going to go too far with a regulatory concept. And you say, oh, no, I have to pull that back. But we have to allow ourselves to do that. You're not going to get it right. It's an experiment. There is no recipe. It's not a script. We don't have a sheet that tells us how to solve this problem. That's why it's great to have innovators and in industry as part of that, because we live in chaos. We live in looking at all the possibilities and finding what works for us through investment, through innovation, through just straight entrepreneurial business sense. We solve a problem, and it's never clean. It's not, you don't get your hands, you get your hands dirty when you solve a problem. And we're going to get our hands dirty collectively and individually. But it doesn't take everyone, but it can involve everyone. It can be a small community of people. If you could have 500 people of astrophysicists, government experts, behavioral scientists, astrophysicists, you name it, all working together as a community saying, okay, what's the question we're trying to solve? How do I keep the economy and space circular and sustainable? You've got more than enough brain power and more than enough to start, as the person asked earlier, a chain reaction for a delta V, a change in trajectory. You can have a huge impact. You can move a mountain with that number of people. It's that collective thinking that we must inspire in each other and not point to one another and say, oh, you're different than me. Say, your contribution is a complement to what I'm doing. And that way we work together as a team. Because the horn section doesn't sound like the drum section or the percussion section in an orchestra, and the choir doesn't sing the parts of the piano. Okay? Everybody has a role in the choir. So we have to let each voice be heard in balance.
I think to pick up on Ruth's analogy before is that we had thousands of years to try to do this, and we keep struggling to get along. Anyone that wants to pitch in on this, then I would like to twist then the answer of Stuart. Like, yes, we need this community. Why we're struggling? Because it's difficult, of course, absolutely. What do you think is the major complexity? Why we cannot pass?
So this is like a beautiful future, and I want that to be true. But as you point out, thousands of years, everybody doesn't come together. But where we make progress as a society is when groups lead and demonstrate the value of that leadership and benefits. And when I use the example of the ban on direct ascent destructive ASAT tests, I want to make sure I have all the words in a row. It wasn't a let's all wait till everyone can agree, particularly when adversarial countries might agree, because that could take us forever. We may never get there. but to say, I am going to take this step forward. And you saw how quickly most of the world followed, very, very quickly. So we have a lot of things. Can we do the same as to say, I'm not going to authorize non-maneuverable satellites in a highly congested orbit? And will people start to agree? Because that isn't creating a new idea, that's capturing a norm that is already existing, but being very affirmative and clear and aggressive so that people can say, I want to do that too. So we get to these models of polycentric governance where it isn't one or everyone, it is the groups that start to interact together, working in their interest and then sharing that interest into a more constructive way with the other lanes of activities. And so we have to not spend all of our time trying to get everyone to agree, and find the pockets of agreement and aggressively move forward with them. Because I think that there is more agreement and more norms than we have currently characterized and quantified.
Thank you. Anything to add, Chris, Kevin? Otherwise, I'm going to take the questions, but I leave the stage to you.
No, I mean, Ruth is right. If you wait till everybody agrees on everything, you'll never get anything done. There's a lot of places where at least the coalition of the willing, as we like to say, are willing to move forward and do things. And so we should take full advantage of that opportunity.
We need a director of the orchestra.
Go ahead for the questions. We only have a few minutes left. I'm open to take a few.
Yeah.
Let's do it, because there are a lot of people that want to ask some very interesting questions. So Sven asked, what mechanism could come into place to incentive sustainable design and operation for all actors up in space, considering the current global political landscape? So it's quite a practical question. It's good. Thank you, Sven.
I'm waiting for Kevin's answer.
I was
I
waiting
think
for
he knows. I know what Kevin's going to say.
Kevin, it's for you.
Again, give it to me again, please. Give it to me again so I can. I'm
considering the current global political landscape,
Right.
what mechanism could come into place to incentivize sustainable design?
Well, again, as I say, I think there are industry forums where people are discussing, best practices, and I think that's where the concrete attention is going to be made to this. Having these discussions at the international level right now really don't seem to result in much progress, except on extreme things, or things that are very crystal clear. So I'm still a fan of saying where industry can come together to describe technical standards and things that they need to do going forward, that they'll do it.
Thank you, Kevin. Ashina is asking, in terms of the role of space for a sustainable future, how can we maintain such a diverse ecosystem while wrestling with all the challenges, such as Kessel syndrome, traffic difficulties of debris? And I think, Ashina, this is something that Chris tackled in the beginning, this kind of joint collaboration of responsibility between all actors. I think everyone here said the starting point was exactly that one. Am I wrong, Chris?
No, you're exactly right. And I would say this is it. And Ashina, was that her name? The fact that she joined this conversation, there's a great starting point. There's a way to have this discussion continue. The fact that the North Star drove this to happen, that I'm on a panel tomorrow here in Paris to talk about these issues. This is it. The conversation is growing. Again, to go back to something else I said earlier when I started with Astroscale in 2017, we came to conferences like this and no one had any idea who we were. And they said, are you guys crazy? You want to start a business and remove space debris and service satellites? What are you, ridiculous? You guys are going to be done in a year. No one was thinking that this was going to be some kind of forward, like a sustainable business idea. And now there's a bunch of other companies out there. And why does that happen? It's because of conversations like this, and because of like-minded people like on this panel that are working together to drive the conversation and to drive the regulations and to drive the technology. And that's how we make it all happen. And as I'm sitting here in Paris, I'm struggling to think of another sports analogy, because there's just been so many out there after the Olympics. Maybe synchronized swimming.
Thank you for finally mentioning a sport that I understand. Thank you, Chris. Because between hockey and football and baseball, I was not even able to understand the metaphors, and so I'm lost here. Thank you. Yes, more synchronized swimming examples. Thank you very much. Isabella is asking a question which I suppose maybe is for you, Stuart. Mentioning the point of collaboration, she's asking to what extent North Star is actually able to collaborate with different companies in the industry. Are you able to set up the good example? Are you able to start a small community?
Technically, yes. Collectively, this activity is a yes to that, and participating in Space Canada, which is the organization in Canada that overlooks activities in the space industry. Technically, from the beginning, North Star's core of our business model is that we would create a concept of operations that was a set of satellites that were taking images in space, designed in a certain way and oriented and with a whole set of technical requirements to optimize our service. But we always recognized right from the beginning that our data alone, no matter how many satellites we were flying, would not be sufficient to provide a complete picture. So you also embed in your model data fusion. So North Star has put as much money and effort into figuring out how to fuse data from multiple sources and multiple types of sensors on the ground in space, RF, radar, LiDAR, synthetic aperture radar, you name it. They seem to all end in R. It's kind of weird. And so all of these things together fuse together to create an operating picture. That requires that you go out to the folks who are your competition and say, I'd like to use your data. I'd like to infuse it into my data and our data and create a better operating picture. And we've had very good response on that. So I don't think I coined the phrase. DINS gave me credit for this at the military SSA conference in England, but I didn't coin the phrase. But the expression is co-opetition. So industrially, you have co-opetition. You cooperate with the people who are supposed to be your competition, and you go further by doing so. You work with organizations like we are in the United States, Riverside Research, a trusted supplier to the US government for military and intelligence activities. And they're a gateway for us because they're an R&D entity that can do things. We don't compete with them, we complement them. And the list goes on. So we've done it at government level, we've done it at industry level, we've done it at industry/government level. And again, it challenges us. North Star was built, as I referred to earlier, on the principle that we have to answer a question, not develop a technology. And the question North Star tried to answer is, how do you monitor 300 trillion cubic kilometers of space effectively and in a timely manner to preserve the environment? And you can ask that question starting today for the next 100 years, and you'll come up with a different answer every day because the environment is changing. So the question doesn't go away. So as long as you're answering that question and continuing answering that question, you're now on the team. And it doesn't matter whether you work for North Star and got the t-shirt or you don't. If you're answering that question, you're on the team because everyone has a different answer from a different perspective.
Well, people are here for the t-shirts too, so let's not forget that.
Let's not lie about it.
Before we close down, I wanted to take one last question, which takes us on a bit of a different road, but because we have experts here, I thought it would be nice to open up towards that sector. How do you see advancement in SSA technology contributing to national security and defense strategy, in particular when it comes to mitigating potential threats in increasingly contested space environments?
Well, how does
So
the Viper building an airplane? It's fundamental to the problem. Go ahead, Kev. Go ahead.
No, so I often look at this based on my many years of looking at the satellite imagery business. I mean, like anything else, we're going to be able to look into space and identify safety issues. We're going to be able to identify, anomalies, and those are going to be of interest from a defense perspective as much as they are from a civil and safety perspective. And so SSA is going to play a huge role. Again, the parallel that I see in my head is in the early days of commercial satellite imagery, looking down, people were asked to do relatively low priority problems, and then over time we're given more advanced things to the point where today satellite imagery and its analytic parallel, are actually included in national intelligence assessments. And I think we're going to see the same trend in space. We're going to need much more detail on a more timely basis for what is happening in the space environment, how things behave. And that's going to be a benefit both to civil operators from a safety perspective and commercial operators, but also from what's called a space domain awareness perspective. It's very hard to argue anything else.
Yeah, I would say the same. It's a critical piece of it because you mentioned the Kessler syndrome. It's not my favorite thing to discuss because I think it's a little bit chicken little, and people say, "Oh, it's not happening, so we don't have to do anything." So it's in everyone's interest to avoid collisions in space. It's in the national security interest of every nation on Earth to avoid collisions in space. And you can develop all of the maneuverability, but if you don't know where the threatening object is, how can you avoid it? And we also have, for the commercial operators, a significant interest in avoiding an unnecessary maneuver. Then if we look at that further into the environmental interest, if you avoid unnecessary maneuvers, you prolong the life of your satellite and you put less satellites in orbit, less mass on orbit, less rocket bodies left in orbit, you create this, again, circular opportunity because we have better knowledge about where the objects are in space and where the threats are in space. So we can't separate security from commercial. Collisions in space are bad for everyone. And it is in everyone's interest to protect their assets in space. And part of that, protecting that asset, is avoiding unnecessary maneuvers, protecting the lifespan of the asset. So that's important for every actor, particularly important where you have very expensive national security assets. You want them to be functional as long as possible. So without SSA, we're just hoping, and we're not going to have a sustainable space environment based on wishes.
Right. Correct.
Fantastic. Chris, do you have anything to add? Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
Fully agreed. Ground-based, space-based SSA transparency and awareness is going to lead to more understanding and more security.
Fantastic. I would say we are 2 minutes over the time. Fantastic questions. Sorry, I was not able to take all of them. Andrew Monham wrote a very interesting question. Andrew, I will make sure maybe to send it to the organizer. They might want to think about it for future ideas and topics. That was a very good point. I would say we can thank everyone on the panel. I say goodbye to Stuart and Ruth in Hawaii. Enjoy your hard day of working. And I thank also the audience that has been here with us, asking us this fantastic question. And of course, I thank a special thank from my side to North Star for supporting this initiative. And the T-shirt, don't forget, some of you have been selected as the lucky winner of the T-shirt. So expect from North Star soon with the details. Chris, Kevin, Ruth, Stuart, thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure for me for moderating this session. I am Emma. I forgot to tell you who I was at the beginning. I'm the editor-in-chief of Spacewatch Global, and it's been my pleasure to be your moderator. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thanks, Emma.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. So long.
Au revoir.